Um, you know, you are one of the few people in a state race who really had no experience in doing what they're running to do beforehand. So I'm curious if you could tell me your story. What made you decide to want to run? What has prepared you for this role over the course of your life and your career?
Yeah, so my background is in education, and I have a master's in Christian apologetics. So, to your point, I'm not one of these individuals who was groomed for public office. I'm just an everyday citizen who saw an issue and was determined to fix it. And during the 2020 election, I saw many things that were illegal, and it's really kind of disappointing that many citizens, such as myself, who came forward saying things that we personally witnessed. It's one thing to have a second or a third hand account, but when things you've personally witnessed and you have this really coordinated effort to discredit it, it made me realize that we were fighting for something that was critical, is the control over our country. And as we've done over 350 events, I've talked to citizens all around the state of different political affiliations who have concerns regarding our election system. Like, I talked to citizens in the city of Pontiac concerned about the District 7 city council race during the 2021 city election, or during the 2022 primary election, how during the Wayne County canvass, they discovered the city of Ecorse had a bag of untabulated ballots. Now, pointing those things out does not make one a threat to democracy. That's nonsense. Those who are parroting those phony talking points simply want to suppress citizens from telling the truth. When it comes to what has prepared me for this moment, I have a background in conflict resolution, but the reality is that as Secretary of State, let's also step back for a moment. None of the Secretary of States, when first starting, have ever been a Secretary of State. Benson was never a clerk. The reality is that as Secretary of State, it's your job to put together teams of competent individuals and know how to problem solve. There's a formula to problem solving that occurs whether you're Secretary of State or whether you're an engineer. There's a formula to problem solving. There's a formula to team building. And also, when it comes to team building, you as Secretary of State are not going to be on the ground necessarily solving all these problems. It's about putting competent individuals together who can give you a feedback loop of what's going on within its respective, whether it's the branch offices, whether it's our elections, whether it's the public notaries. And that way you know what's going on, and then you can solve those problems. And then you have the administrative oversight to make sure that they have the tools they need to be successful.
Sure. I know people throw around the term, right, political outsider. Is that something that you view yourself as, again, having never held office before running? Is that something that you maybe lean into? Or
yeah, absolutely, because people want a fresh set of eyes. During the primary, I heard a lot of people say to me, we don't want a retread, because unfortunately, many people in public office, not all, of course, many people in public office have never really worked in the private sector. You look at Senator Debbie Stabenow, Joe Biden. They've never had a job in the private sector. They don't know what it's like to be on the other side of a government decision. So oftentimes we have people in office who do not live with the consequences of the policies that they create, and they just benefit from them. So oftentimes citizens want a person who's been on the other side of that SOS desk, a person who's been on the other side of witnessing something illegal in our election system, to be an advocate for them. And people are tired of elected officials with secret agendas. I don't have a secret agenda. I don't like being lied about. I don't like having my personal life picked apart and false claims being made about me, but we deal with it because we love our country. And irrespective of party, I do not care what your political affiliation is. Every citizen wants their voting rights protected, which consists of ballot access, ballot security, and preventing illegal ballots from being cast.
Yeah. Well, let's set the record straight on some of the things that, again, people have said about it. I heard that a Michigan GOP chair, former chair, called it a delusional fantasy about the election being stolen from Donald Trump in 2020. Do you still have legitimate concerns about the 2020 election? And if so, again, what are they? I've heard your testimony again before the Senate Oversight Committee, but do you still have those same concerns?
Well, the things I personally witnessed were never resolved. So, of course, I have those concerns. But some, like that individual you referred to, he's just a vulgar person. And some people, they have their own secret agendas for being. So it's kind of bizarre, to be honest with you, that when citizens bring forth legitimate concerns, like, for example, Jocelyn Benson trying to get a case tossed out of court where they want her to simply remove dead people from the voter rolls. Or I've talked to a lot of people who have spouses who are non-citizens who are registered to vote. And this non-citizen, who's in the country legally, by the way, did not register themselves to vote. Pointing those things out are very legitimate. That's not a conspiracy theory. And so what should concern Michiganders is why there's such a coordinated effort to suppress the truth. How many people are benefiting from this corrupted election system? And now we have put together this series, Benson's Dirty Deeds, where we are going after piece by piece by piece by piece by piece of something illegal or unethical she has done. Or when you look at the situation with Connect, when you think of a Michigan-based company potentially storing data and information from our elections on servers in China, and then Governor Whitmer recently gave this company $300,000 of our tax dollars, that doesn't make one a conspiracy theorist or a threat to democracy for pointing it out. Those suppressing the truth are the threat to our democratic process, not me for speaking up about it.
By that same token, after 2020, there were 250 audits, including one by the committee that you testified in front of. Wouldn't those audits, wouldn't those investigations have found any widespread wrongdoing if it existed?
I'm so glad you asked that question. First, those audits were conducted by Jocelyn Benson. So in what universe does the person under suspicion get to investigate themselves?
Well, one was done by lawmakers.
Well, they actually didn't conduct an audit. They conducted an outcome-based investigation where they asked for the Attorney General to consider criminally investigating people alleging fraud in the election. Those individuals have no credibility in my estimation, and I do not care if they are Republican. Because anytime you ask for the Attorney General to consider criminally investigating people for exercising my right of freedom of speech and my right to petition the government for a redress of grievances. After the 2016 election, we saw many Democrats allege fraud, say that Hillary Clinton really won. At no point did I think these people should go to jail or be criminally investigated. And as a matter of fact, because of that report, we have footage of Dana Nessel saying, quote, that I could be charged with I was potentially committing a felony and could be criminally charged, end quote. That's from our Attorney General. So now we're going to jail people for calling out government corruption? I don't care how bogus one thinks it is. That should scare every Michigander. No one should be afraid of going to jail for simply speaking truth about something that they think. I don't care if a person is saying something bogus, they still shouldn't go to jail for it. But even with those investigations, they even admitted in their report that their investigation was not exhaustive. So if your investigation is not exhaustive, you cannot make a dogmatic claim. And then they ignore many of the things that we complained about. And when we look at the fact from the Auditor General's report, they stated that Secretary Benson was not reconciling the QVF with the driver's license file. Additionally, they also cited, which I also found to be true talking to clerks across the state, that they could not understand how the risk-limited audit, she did not even follow her own audit manual. So let me point this out. As Secretary of State, if I'm overseeing a highly contentious election, I'm going to go through every check and balance I can legally do to ensure that not only things were ran accurately, the way the people of this state could be confident. Because one of the things that is necessary for us to be unified in our pluralistic society, that people have faith in our systems. But when citizens have issues and they're demonized, and then you don't even follow your own audit procedures, you opt for a risk-limited audit. And as I alluded to the clerks a moment ago, the clerks of our state even stated themselves that they did not understand how inspecting a few ballots in some random precincts was going to affirm that election procedure had been properly followed. It makes no sense. So my question goes back, why the organized cover-up to suppress the truth? That is what should concern Michiganders, irrespective of political affiliation. And as we go across this state and we look at what's going on in Southfield, you have a woman continuing to run elections who is being indicted for election fraud crimes. You look at what happened in Genesee County, where you had a clerk clip a ballot seal. And citizens have been complaining amongst themselves for years about these issues. And this is why I will defeat Jocelyn Benson November 8th.
Do you have concerns about the upcoming November election as you did, similar to the ones you still have for 2020?
Oh, of course. Well, one, she refuses to clean up the voter registration database. There's a current lawsuit against her, which we held a press conference about her suppression of poll challengers. Poll challengers are not these adversarial figures that Jocelyn Benson tries to portray them to be. Poll challengers are the guardians on the ground, that I like to call them. These are citizens who are just overseeing the process. They're not going in there. I'm not saying there aren't some rogue individuals. I won't make that claim, because I'm sure any profession, any group, you're going to have a few people here and there who are not there for the right reason. I can't speak to the mind of every single individual. But overall, poll challengers are there to be the guardians on the ground to ensure that the election process is being followed accurately. That's not an adversarial figure. And then my opponent is falsely claiming that there will be violence, potentially violence and disruption on election day. And then she refuses to provide any police reports. Now, if there's all these threats to election workers' lives like she claims that there are, where are the police reports? Who are these potential assailants? If someone was threatening our election workers and our clerks, as Secretary of State, I would be making sure that the police were notified, that there would be investigations, that we will find these potential assailants. I would be all over it, not just making claims in the media. And then on top of that, her edict that she issued regarding poll challengers' rights for the 2022 election is illegal. I'm not even an attorney, and I could try that case in court, where she's violating the law again to make it to where citizens can't see under the hood. No election official, elected official, or person who does not want the people that they serve to scrutinize them cannot be trusted, period.
Are you talking about certified poll watch? Because again, like if we're talking about security, we can't have people. Would you suggest they be in there for the counting of these ballots? Would you suggest they be in there at precincts? Because there is, I think unless someone has training and is authorized to be familiar with these processes, that also, if they're not, that could be a security concern as well, no?
Well, to your point, you're correct. The law already states that individuals cannot just wander off the street. You're correct. There are laws governing poll challengers' conduct, and there's also laws governing those who suppress poll challengers from doing their job, who can be sent to jail or pay a $1,000 fine. So the law is clear. You're absolutely correct that you can't just have some random individual walking off the street to be a poll challenger. You have to come in with the credentialed organization. So when I was a poll challenger in 2020, we had to go through training. So absolutely, the law, my point is I'm a rule of law Secretary of State. My opponent is lawless. My point is that we simply have to follow the law, like you said, to ensure that we have credentialed individuals who know what they're doing walking in, not just Joe Schmo off the street.
I think we've touched on a couple of these points, but I just want to ask, kind of all-encompassing, what would convince you that a state election was run fairly and was run securely?
That it's ran by the law. That's it. Just follow the law. Nothing, and it's interesting when we talk about voting rights. Like I said before, ballot access, ballot security, and preventing illegal ballots from being cast. Oftentimes when we talk about voting rights, we don't explore what that really means. We just throw the term around. And if my ballot, if I don't have access to the polls, then what good is an election? If my absentee ballot, we saw during the August primary about 1.4 million people vote absentee. And as I mentioned, what happened in e-courts is what they discovered during the canvass. Okay, those people marked the ballot, but their ballot wasn't tabulated. So we have to ensure that that ballot is securely handled every step of the way. We also need to prevent illegal ballots from being cast. Those three elements are necessary components of our voting rights. And as Secretary of State, I don't care what your political party is, what your religion, or anything about you. You have a constitutional right to a protected and honest election. And I will ensure that the rule of law is followed as Michigan Secretary of State.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said, I want to get down to some of the, actual cogs of elections and how you would run them. For funding, I know that certainly there are clerks that always have concerns about funding elections, making sure that they have the funds they need to make it safe. How would you propose funding elections? Would you put more onus on the state or on the local clerks themselves, the municipalities, federal funding for elections?
I said the onus goes on the state. The Secretary of State brings in about $2.9 billion a year, and only 7% of that goes to running the Michigan Department of State. One of the massive issues we have in Michigan is the way these funds are appropriated. I would not put the burden on the state, on the county or the local municipality. Why? Because the Secretary of State makes edicts local municipality are required to follow. And one of the issues in 2020, when Jocelyn Benson mailed out all those absentee ballot applications unsolicited, it created a situation in the local municipality that many had to hire additional people. And for a lot of low-income municipalities, they don't have the funds to hire those people. And so many citizens, not because we are stupid, but when you read absentee ballot applications, you assume, oh, I guess they didn't get the first one, so I need to send in another. And so the Secretary of State is making decisions that impact the local municipality without providing them the necessary resources. That's a bad administrator. So absolutely, if the Secretary of State is going to make all of these edicts, then the onus is on the state, not the municipality. That's not to say the local municipality doesn't bear some of the responsibility. But one of the issues we're having is that they're making all these decisions And then the local municipality is left with the burden. And then what oftentimes happens is that many have to then go to the taxpayer and say, hey, we need to raise your property taxes, which impacts low-income communities, individuals, and particularly seniors.
Yeah. I think kind of a paradox of this, though, is, a lot of lawmakers, certainly ones that we've talked to, are hesitant about funding elections because they have concerns about the process already. How do you go to the legislature and make sure that they can come up with this money and work with them to ensure that these elections are well funded?
I think transparency. A lot of people have no idea how our election systems work. And sometimes a lot of the concern isn't necessarily individuals are engaging in illegal activity. Some of it is human error. But then the voter is disenfranchised at the less. So it's important to have a transparent process and be very open with the public how our elections work, and being very open with our legislature of how it works. Because to your point, if I just approach, hey, I need $100,000, you're going to say, well, what do you need it for? Well, I'm not going to tell you. Well, that's absurd. I need to be able to itemize exactly how each dollar is going to be spent. That way you can have confidence that $100,000, this is just an arbitrary figure, that you're giving me is going to actually be utilized for the purposes I claim they're going to be utilized for and not be wasted. That's the have is waste. And so we want to prevent that waste from occurring. And that starts with transparency. That way there's also accountability, and then the legislature will be more comfortable allotting or appropriating those funds for the operation of our elections. But as I mentioned before, considering how much the Secretary of State actually brings into the state of Michigan, I would argue we have money to ensure that our elections are more properly funded.
Yeah. Speaking of elections as well, Proposal 2 is on the ballot, of course, in November. Is there anything in there that you like? Is there anything that you would keep, even if it weren't to fail, is there anything that you might implement from Proposal 2? If there isn't, again, to get people early access to voting, to get people expanded access to voting, and to fund these elections, what would your approach be if Proposal 2 were to fail?
I would like to say this. I've talked to a lot of local clerks who are totally against Proposal 2, but they're terrified of Benson, so they won't speak up. I've got a lot of local clerks. As a matter of fact, I was at an event once where a local clerk was handing out literature feverishly, saying we must defeat this. Couple of reasons. When they talk about early access, that's very deceptive because we already have 40 days of absentee voting. So having 9 days of in-person voting, it actually weakens the election, because one of the things that I have a right to is a secret ballot. Now, I am not alleging that folks operating our elections will do something illegal. I think that's what we need to understand. Considering that securing our elections are inextricably linked to our liberty, we have to operate with the worst case scenario, that potentially rogue actors can violate the law. That means that we're assuming that people will violate the law. Those are two separate things. When we have 9 days of early in-person voting, it opens the door for my ballot to be exposed. That's number one. Number two, it makes operating elections more expensive because you have to staff your office differently. Number three, to allow multiple municipalities to vote is crazy. I can't think of a better adjective. It makes no sense whatsoever. And when you think about how our elections operate, and when you think of, for example, if a precinct does not balance, you can't recount that precinct. And if anything goes a little wrong, guess who takes blame? Not the Secretary of State many times, it's the local clerk. So operating the elections are going to be so much more complicated. And then when you vote absentee, you can drop off your absentee ballot in person if you want to. You don't have to submit it through the mail. You can get your absentee ballot, fill it out, and give it to your local clerk, hand it straight to them. So there's no reason to have an exposed ballot for 9 days. Additionally, private money in our election door to bribery. I'm sure you're aware there's a lawsuit going on right now against Jocelyn Benson and the Zuckerberg scam. The reason why that's such a problem because that money was funneled overwhelmingly to Democratic cities. And if you look at how much election workers in Detroit made compared to another municipality, it was huge. And so it opens the door for bribery. It opens the door for an individual who has a lot of money to go and fund elections and get their particular agenda accomplished, which goes against the will of the people. Now, is that to say individuals will do that? No, I can't say individuals will do that, but they could easily do that. So if we want our elections to be bribed, that is a violation of the very foundation of our republic. That is a massive issue. Also, to do away with ID requirements, it makes no sense. If you have a lot of members of the population who do not have an ID, it's like Secretary Benson is failing at her job because it's the job of the state to ensure people have an ID. People need an ID to do more than just vote. People need an ID to get a bank account, to work, to go into a federal building. To be a meaningful adult in life, you have to have an ID. So the solution is not to weaken our election systems. The solution is to identify what barriers exist to individuals can get an ID so they can be meaningful participants in society.
Yeah, good segue. I wanted to talk about some of the efficiency elements of the job too. Of course, obviously with the pandemic, things had to change. So the SOS offices switched to an appointment-based system. Would you keep the existing system of making appointments, moving more services mobile? What would your approach to making the office more efficient be if you were elected?
I would improve the system. We need our appointments, but we also need walk-in services. Let's say a person has a house fire. Can you wait a week or two to get into your Secretary of State's office? No, you cannot. So we need both walk-in and appointment services. The way you do that is have staff dedicated to appointment services and staff dedicated to walk-in services. Because again, life happens. And oftentimes an individual or even a business, say you have a business who acquired 3 or 4 vehicles at an auction. They don't have time to wait a week to get into the Secretary of State's office to register those vehicles. They need to get in right away. So I do believe the online services are great, but we need to remember that there are many members of our community who are unbanked and underbanked. They cannot utilize online services. So it's kind of like this elitist attitude that my opponent actually has, that many people who can't participate in her vision of a branch office just get left out. That's not what a public servant does. That's not what a servant. What about members of our elderly members of our community? Oftentimes they struggle with the online appointments or online services, so they need that walk-in system. So we must protect the walk-in system while still maintaining the appointment system. I have no plans of doing away with that because likewise, there are many people whose lives are very regimented, need that appointment system. They cannot go into an SOS office and hope they can be seen. Because one of the promises my opponent made on the campaign trail was a 30-minute wait time. That was a lie. Because when it comes to walk-in services, you cannot guarantee wait time. That's why we need to protect the appointment system. So we need both. And I would also like to see us explore ideas like what DNR does licenses, where some local businesses could provide certain SOS services. But we have to protect both the walk-in and appointment system. And also, I would like to add, as I mentioned earlier, considering how much the Secretary of State brings in, we need to lower the fees. People pay way too much. And a lot of low-income families, when it comes to renewing, they're uncomfortable. Because they may have to choose between how much food do I have and can I register my vehicle. And for many people, that may seem outrageous, but for low-income people, every dollar matters.
Yeah, certainly. I'm glad you brought that up. I wanted to ask you about specific fees and what could be lowered. You mentioned registrations. Anywhere else that you would be looking to cut fees?
I mean, I would explore we could legally cut fees. I believe that the SOS should represent the cost of doing business. And I also do believe that we have some responsibility to the roads. We do. Because you drive on a public road, we all have to contribute to that public road. But I would explore everywhere possible we could legally lower the fees that we pay in our SOS branch offices. Because not only do I talk about the individual, but also when we talk about lowering fees for a business, people need to remember the lower the cost for a business to operate, the lower the cost for the consumer. So, I mean, I hate to sound selfish, but I believe just as a moral standpoint, we need to be friendly to our business community, but also the lower our businesses pay, the lower we pay when we use their service, their good or service.
Yeah, thank you. A couple more questions. Election day should be a holiday.
Yeah, I believe so, 100%. I believe Election Day should be a holiday for a couple of reasons. One, because there are challenges for people to vote in person. There are, because a lot of people cannot get the time off of work, and then especially if they live in a densely populated city, that they wait in a longer line. So I believe Election Day being a holiday would really help a lot of more people vote. It would encourage more people to be election workers. One of the things that I'm talking to local clerks across the state, because as Secretary of State, I want to have a very open door of communication with our local clerks to ensure that their needs are being met and their concerns are heard, is that a lot of our local clerks have a hard time with people. And so if Election Day is a holiday, then they will be more properly staffed because, as you know, being an Election Day worker is not a permanent job. It's very seasonal, even more seasonal than a Christmas job. And so that would be important. Also encouraging citizens to be poll challengers and poll watchers. And so I believe that oftentimes sometimes people have concerns, not necessarily because of violation, it's because sometimes people don't understand the process. So if more citizens are engaged in the process of being an election worker and being a poll challenger and poll watcher, not only will we have more voter turnout, but also we'll have more people engaged and confident in the process.
Yeah. You have been out fundraised by Secretary Benson. A lot of times it comes with the story of just running against an incumbent.
Mm-hmm.
The question is, though, how have you managed to get your name out? How have you been letting people know that you're out there? I know you guys haven't run a lot of TV ads or media or anything like that. So how do you let people know, given the grassroots nature of this campaign, that you are out there and that you're running?
Well, I think it's also important to note that there are millions of dollars being poured into the state, and that should concern Michiganders. I mean, we all have friends and family members from out of state who support our campaign, but the fact that you have millions upon millions of dollars being pumped into Michigan to sway our elections, that means that people outside of Michigan are trying to control our state. I think that's something we should point out. Secondarily is that we've been working hard. Good old-fashioned elbow grease. We've been talking to people. We've done over 350 events. And one of the things that makes our campaign unique is I expose myself to questions. I love it when people ask me questions. So, for example, I went to an event recently where it was all Democrats there. I'm the only Republican, and I loved every minute of it. To be able to engage people, have them ask them questions and hear their concerns. Because I think one of the things that we are committed to changing is that oftentimes, citizens who may be of the opposing political party, if their candidate doesn't win, they worry. Why? Because they feel like they're not going to get service. They feel like the person isn't going to care about them. It's just like a lot of people unfortunately have this attitude that unless this person votes for, really don't care about the needs of that person because that person isn't one of their voters. I don't operate that way. I was at an event once and a man told me he would never vote for a Republican. And I said, that's okay. I'm still going to serve you. It doesn't really matter. I'm going to serve everyone. And so we've just been working really hard to get our name out and to talk to people and have that conversations. And we have a ground game. Benson can have all the money she wants, because you can't buy that type of authentic support we have. That's organic, that's real, and that's what's going to save this state and nation.
Some people and voters as well too have raised concerns about past comments that have been made that might make them feel targeted. Some people were concerned about, at one point, I believe during a podcast, you said that trans people were mentally ill adults playing dress up. Presumably you would have trans constituents. Likewise, living together pre-marriage compared to normalized pedophilia, you would have people who are living together that might need to do business at the Secretary of State. What about those who say that your personal beliefs would be a deterrent?
America is a pluralistic society. And if we think we're going to get an elected official who agrees with everything we believe, think again. That's not how it works. As Secretary of State, irrespective of anyone's religious beliefs, personal beliefs, lifestyle, whatever category, ethnicity, it doesn't matter. I have an obligation to serve them. That's how our pluralist society works. That's how this American experiment has worked so well. It's because we put aside whatever beliefs we have that are different and serve and love one another. As it's important to note that I have a master's in Christian apologetics. So I ran a podcast dissecting the world from a biblical worldview. So naturally, people who don't share worldview are going to not like and disagree with the things that I stated. And that's okay. If there was a person of a different religious belief or a different lifestyle or what have you, and that was a competent individual, I don't care. Are you competent? Can you do the job? That's what matters to me. So in a pluralistic society, we can't have this kind of cancel culture or purist test, and we think we're going to maintain this republic. In a pluralistic society, we're going to have people of varying beliefs of all sorts of things, all sorts of subjects. There are people in office who believe things I think are absolutely absurd. Doesn't matter. Is the person going to do their job? Is the person going to honor their oath of office? Is that person going to honor my constitutional rights? And that's what matters. I'll do for every Michigander, irrespective of any belief that they may hold.
Yeah, thank you for that. Do you guys have anything additional? All right. You've exhausted my list.
Yes.
I do want to ask quick.
Yeah.
You talked a little bit about photo IDs, and I know that that's part of Prop 2. What do you feel? How do you feel about if I'm an 18-year-old who doesn't quite have a driver's license yet, but I have my school ID, it has a picture of me and my name? How is that any different from voting versus showing a state ID?
Well, the school ID. Here's the thing: a state ID I know as Secretary of State, sorry. With the state ID, I as Secretary of State know that it's valid. With the Secretary of State being keeper of the records, they know legitimate documents and illegitimate documents. So that's why we have to have this strict protocol, because you're always going to have what if scenarios. You cannot govern with what if scenarios. You have to have what is the most secure that exists to ensure that we have an accurate election. And what's wonderful is that if you have like a low income citizen, they have certain abilities to get a free ID. And as a matter of fact, our Republican legislature did pass legislation, which Whitmer vetoed, to make it even easier for low-income people to get an ID. So it's important that people are properly identified, but we cannot govern based on what-if scenarios. We just can't.
Yeah.
That's where judges come in for the what-if scenarios.
Certainly, that's why the courts exist. And I did think of one more question as well. I skipped. We had the legislature recently approve for 10,000 plus municipalities 2 days of pre-processing for ballots. Is that anything you support? Do you want pre-processing? I know the reason I ask, right, is because, especially for us, reporting results on election night, we know that, we may not have a full picture yet on election night. With pre-processing, that makes it a lot easier. It kind of eliminates the ability for misinformation to spread on election night and beyond. Would you support any level of pre-processing, and if so, how much would you like?
Well, let me point out to misinformation. I think oftentimes we have to be careful, because sometimes it's just information that goes against the narrative, and sometimes the narrative is false. But also, when it comes to pre-processing, actually what we should do is ensure that the municipality is properly staffed. That's the solution. Pre-processing, considering that we have very weak chain of custody procedures when it comes to our absentee ballots. That's how, I've talked to multiple individuals, and whenever, I'm sure you can imagine, I talk to people all across the state where, a person I know who works for a clerk's office, when they went to this PS office to pick up absentee ballots, they were not asked for any credentials. So, or I talked to a person who worked during the 2020 election for the city of Detroit, and when they dropped off ballots at the TCF Center, they were not asked for any credentials. So there are serious chain of custody issues with our absentee ballot process. So the solution, to your point, is to get things done timely, is more pre-processing, is to have more manpower, because that's ultimately the issue. There's a manpower shortage that prevents them from processing the absentee ballots in a timely manner. So if we have more manpower, then we can ensure that those ballots are processed securely and timely.
All right. Thank you for that.
Thank you so much.